Hey everyone, back again. Today I want to tell you about Gilles Deleuze's writings on Palestine, because Deleuze was committed to the Palestinian struggle. Now, I'm going to cover 4 of his texts here, hence the title, not listing each of the texts. I'm going to cover Stones. I'm going to cover The Spoilers of Peace. I'm going to cover, regrettably, as far as the title goes, The Indians of Palestine, which I'm going to, from this point on, refer to as the indigenous people of Palestine, at least the title. And finally, The Grandeur of Yasser Arafat. Now, before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. I explain philosophical concepts and ideas and ways to make them accessible to you. So if you're new here, you can subscribe and see videos I release every single week. If you like what I do and want to help, you can do that thing, like subscribing. You can help me out monetarily, but don't. Instead, consider donating to one of the organizations listed below to help Palestinians in need, to get them out of Gaza or to get them aid as much as humanly possible. But don't let your activism stop there. If you go to my Instagram page, you can find a list I've compiled of all Canadian public officials if you're Canadian, and you can email them. Just copy paste it. It'll take you 1 second. Copy paste it and write to them to demand for a ceasefire immediately, because the Canadian government is not doing all that it can to stop the carnage in Gaza. And there's so many other things that you can do if you are able. Showing up to protests, follow pages that schedule protests and that put out calls for people to join protests. Get involved with organizing in any organization, whether it's the Palestinian Youth Movement or Jewish Voices for Peace or anything like that. Any organization that you can participate in to help mount pressure on our governments to stop funding Israel's slaughter of Palestinians. That is the primary goal right now that needs to happen immediately, and it should have happened 7 months ago. But that's not the case, hence we must keep the pressure on. So let's jump into Gilles Deleuze's writings on Palestine. And the first thing is probably, like, why am I covering this French white dude about Palestine? I'm doing it because I'm trying to really appeal to many people who are surprisingly quite silent within the theory world. That is, to make it clear that their God, many of them, Deleuze, was not silent about this, and neither should they be. And this is my effort to try and appeal to them. So let's start out with the first text called Stones. And depending on which translation you actually read, they might have different names. So for now, like the one that I'm using is called Stones. Now, all of these texts come from his writings on 2 regimes of madness, which were a compilation of his writings and interviews between 1975 and the mid-90s, which should give you an idea about just how long this issue has been going on, just how long Palestinians have been living under Israeli occupation, if that wasn't clear enough. And if you want more on that, you can listen to my episodes on Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, or on Edward Said's The Question of Palestine, or on A.L. Wiseman's Lethal Theory, or on Shumbembe's Necropolitics, or even Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she describes how ironic it is that the Jews would undergo the horrors of the Holocaust, and then many of them would go to Palestine and inflict similar horrors against the Palestinian people, which for Hannah Arendt made absolutely no sense. And so she could not reconcile that with this victimhood status that she herself felt as a Jewish woman, and that many of her friends and family who were going to Israel, many of them were embracing. Now, to begin with Stones, Deleuze recounts how following the Holocaust, Zionists who'd moved to Palestine, or Jewish people, many of whom actually didn't want to, who were expected to, in many cases, forced to move to Palestine, even though they saw their homes as being in Hungary or Germany or Romania or wherever, who were forced to move to Palestine, they used Palestinian land against Palestinians. That is, they threw stones at Palestinians, among other things. But stones is a recurring theme throughout this very short text. And Deleuze uses this to call attention to the ways in which people and land share an intimate connection. Now, for those of you familiar with Deleuze's philosophy, specifically with his writings with Guattari, it might seem strange for him to advocate for a kind of national identity, or that anyone has any real connection to the land. And I think that we can immediately disregard and refute that argument or that viewpoint, because for Deleuze, really what the point is here for the Palestinian people is to permit fluidity, is to permit flux, not through violence. In fact, it is violence, specifically the violence of the Israeli regime, that conceals people, that restricts them, that limits their lines of flight, that limits their rhizomatic potential as a people, their attachment to the land, to grow with the land, to change with the land, to develop with the land. And so when people are cast out of their land, they are denied that very opportunity to be human. And this has been one of the Zionist strategies for more than a century now, because the earliest Zionist efforts began long before the Holocaust, where there were many terrorist Zionist regimes, many of which I'm going to cover in this episode, that worked tirelessly to murder, displace, and dispossess Palestinians way before World War II. And one of these organizations was called Irgun. And Irgun was responsible for the Deir Yassin massacre and for massacring and displacing actually English colonizers who were also evil in that they were colonizing the Arab world. But these radical Zionist terrorists were responsible for propelling Jewish immigration into what they believed to be was their land, what they believed to be was their holy land, by displacing Palestinians primarily, but also the English colonizers who were also participating in evil colonialism at the time. Now, their job, or the goal that they set themselves, was to try to rid that land of as many Palestinians as they could by outright murdering them or displacing them, getting them to actually leave Palestine. And this was to prime the world for the narrative that Palestine was just empty land before Jewish immigration finally took foot after World War II. It was to convince the world as though there was just empty land that anyone could colonize and that anyone could occupy. But of course, that wasn't the case at all. After World War II, when many European Jews were forced to move to Palestine from their Zionist leaders, they had to do so by displacing nearly 1 million Palestinians and murdering countless more, and then continuing a legacy of occupation and dispossession of Palestinian people for decades afterwards, up till today. And during all of this, Palestinians have been expected, or Israel has expected Palestinians to recognize Israel's right to exist, and that Israel has a fundamental right to exist on that territory, something that the Israeli regime always refuses for the Palestinians. The Israeli regime, and the great irony here is that we know full well, coming out of Nazi Germany, the horrors that come when a people are denied statehood. The Israeli regime has absolutely no problem refusing to recognize Palestinian statehood and to give Palestinians rights like any other human. And as we know from Hannah Arendt, the first right that any human can expect and that everyone must expect is the right to have rights. And that is systematically and has been systematically denied to Palestinians. And so they have been at war. They have been at war for more than 75 years against their occupiers. They have used their stones, and in many cases they are forced to rely on the land, to use the land to their advantage, to try to mount any kind of resistance they can to the Israeli regime. And even when that resistance is peaceful, it is met with gunfire, it is met with violence, it is met with repression. Or if Palestinians are just sleeping in their homes, they might be bombed. They might have IDF soldiers break through their house, arrest one of their children and never see them again, to be among the more than many thousands of children that are currently being held in Israel without a chance of seeing any kind of criminal trial or court under the pretense of them being terrorists or something like that. Children, yeah. And by the way, all of these are verifiable facts that you can just immediately go and look up in case that you're a little unsure about this. But in this case, they're called prisoners. They aren't called hostages. And it's interesting to see how language works in these cases to defang the horrors that one side commits while amplifying the horrors that the other commits. And Deleuze recognizes the Palestinian spirit, and I think this is something that many people have awoken to, and that is the Palestinian spirit is like no other, and it stands in for the spirit of all oppressed people in the face of colonial oppression or any other kind of oppression, in that they will not surrender to that oppression. That is, even when their lives are on the line, many Palestinians will always refuse to leave. Most of them will refuse to leave because that is their land and that is their home. It's something that everybody or most people would do in that situation, because this is what it means to be a person. It means to have a connection to a land. It means to have a connection to a people that you are a part of, not to detach yourself from that, even though that is exactly what the Israeli regime wants these people to leave and flee into Jordan or to Lebanon or to Egypt. But that is not their home. Their home is in Palestine, where they have been for centuries. Now, Deleuze also calls out the irony of the Israeli regime's insistence on looking at all Palestinians as terrorists, viewing them all, in his words, as Abu, or something that we often hear is that any undescript terrorist is called Muhammad. And he says that it wasn't actually that long ago, when he was writing this, when all Jewish people were just viewed as being Levi, that was their name, to the Nazi regime. And the horrors that came as a result of this homogenization of a people, a reduction of a people to a stereotype that could then be used to justify their eradication. And in his words, to conclude his short piece, the stones that are thrown from the hands of the Palestinians are their stones, living stones of their country. And I think that it's a beautiful way to conclude this first piece. And that puts us here into the spoilers of peace, his next text on Palestine. So in the face of all of this, how are Palestinians actually expected to act in the way that the international community has historically expected of them? Because any kind of resistance that they mount is branded as being, either terrorist or being out of line or anything like that. How can they do it any other way when they are systematically denied statehood, when they're systematically denied the opportunity to mount any kind of change in the way that they want to be able to have voting rights on that very territory that they reside on, to be able to have the kind of representation that Jews lacked during World War II and that was exploited by the Nazi regime in order to eradicate 6 million of them. No, instead, all that the Palestinians are offered, as Deleuze writes, all that they are offered is death. And one of the things about this is that, you hear incessantly about Palestinian violence against Israelis, at least before October 7th. This is something that's always been amplified and up till October 7th. But did you know that in 2008, Israel launched a 25 or almost a month-long barrage of Gaza, killing 1,400 people? The same number of people that Hamas had killed on October 7th, at least according to the first numbers. Now the number is like 1,139, around there, 700 of which are civilians. 700 and a certain number were civilians. However, in 2008, Israel killed 1,400 people in Gaza. They say, they were all terrorists. That was not true, of course. But it's interesting how in that case, Palestinians are denied any opportunity to retaliate, any justification to retaliate. So following October 7th, we have now seen approximately 40,000 people murdered by the Israeli regime, all because of October 7th. So they can justify any violence against Palestinians because they can point to history and say, it's because of that. But at any point, if you look at Palestinian violence against Israelis and say, well, historically, you can't even get those words out of your mouth before you're being shut down or called a Hamas supporter or a terrorist or anything else like that. So why is it in one case, why is it in the case of Israel, context is always invoked, the context being October 7th? Why is it that Palestinians are always denied the opportunity to be given a moment for context so that their occupation can be put into context to understand October 7th, for example? Why are they denied that? Is this a product of an unequal power distribution? I think that that's the likeliest scenario indeed. And Deleuze writes exactly that. Deleuze writes, decades ago, he was writing, that the actions of the Israelis are seen as legitimate retaliation, whereas the actions of the Palestinians are without fail branded as terrorist crimes. And it's interesting to see how this playbook has been going on again and again and again for decades. How we've seen that Deleuze was well aware of what was going on back then. Deleuze was fully aware of exactly the Israeli strategy to disqualify the Palestinian struggle and right to existence. And in all of this, Palestinians are seen as the problem. Palestinians are seen as the ones inhibiting the possibility for peace. But so long as peace depends upon them giving up their land, that is not their problem. Well, it is their problem in that they're suffering from it, but it's not a problem produced by them. Just before October 7th, the year before, Netanyahu had approved more than 10 illegal new settlements in the West Bank. The West Bank, so no Hamas, the West Bank. No Hamas, no terrorists, so to speak, approving this systematic capture of Palestinian territory. And this has been going on for decades, a slow encroachment on the territory until the Palestinians fight back. And then the Israeli regime says that they are terrorists and uses that to take over more land. And this is their playbook, and they will keep doing it again and again and again until it seems as though the end goal is to take over as much Palestinian land as possible. Who knows at what point the Israeli regime will say, yep, now it's okay, you can have your state. We should not allow them to be the ones to say when the Palestinians get to have a state. The entire international community, except for the US and a handful of other countries, Canada, the UK, and Israel, are all in support of Palestinian statehood. Where is the international community now? Where's the international democracy, the international rule of law? Where is all that? Suddenly that's out the window. Something that the US and Israel claims to abide by, the stronghold democracies. They throw all of that out the window the minute it does not satisfy their geopolitical interests. But don't get it twisted. Palestinians have not been the only victims of Israeli violence. Israel has held no punches in murdering people in southern Lebanon, and this long history here, well through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially in the early 80s, when Israel just bombed refugees in southern Lebanon, killing countless Lebanese citizens, many of whom were just like farmers, just on their land, bombed to nothing while they were trying to kill Arafat. They were trying to murder Arafat, the leader of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. But Arafat didn't care. Arafat was like, well, he cared about his people, but Arafat was like, you know, his life was on the line, and he was actually mocking the Israelis in certain ways. But the Israeli regime just murdered so many refugees in southern Lebanon. And I'm recording this just a few days after Israel murdered more than 50 people in a refugee camp in Rafah. And how many more refugees they're going to kill is we'll only have to wait and see. I mean, as horrendous as that is to say, but they have a track record of doing this, and that's why they must immediately be stopped. And so, given this history of Israeli violence against Palestinians, Deleuze says that their greatest opposition actually comes from within, insofar as Israel views itself as being the wielder of Palestinian territory. And in that case, because they see themselves as occupying that land, it is their own doing that bring forward the freedom fighters that will fight them and continue to fight them. Many of the freedom fighters that are fighting and that were fighting in the 90s and early 2000s were related to or even within southern Lebanon when Israel murdered their families and friends who were sheltering and cowering in tents and then having their family just destroyed into nothing. And then in the face of that, what else would they do? I encourage anyone else to think of what they would do in that situation. Or the example I like to give is like, imagine a situation in which Mexico, for example, wanted to reclaim its land in Texas. And so it says, we have a right to return. This is our land. We were here first. And so the Mexican people occupied Texas, put it under strict lock and key. You can't leave or enter Texas without going through Mexican checkpoints and a border. And I wonder if Texans, because there are a few Texans who are very pro-Zionist, I wonder how many of them would be cool with that. And if they'd say, yeah, right to return. Yeah, this is good. Sick. Yeah, I'm down with this. This is totally cool. I'd be very curious how many Zionist Texans would be down with that. I wouldn't be down with that. In fact, I would oppose that. But we have to ask, how many of them would be cool with it? And it's sad, but using an example like this to put somebody in that position is a good way to get them to realize actually how horrible this situation is. Now, Israel and its branding almost anyone as terrorists actually set the template and taught the Americans how to then respond to terrorists, branding nearly anyone a terrorist. And Deleuze was absolutely prophetic about this, suggesting that Israel then taught the US essentially how to conduct what it would do in the war on terror. Brand anyone a terrorist that it disagrees with, and then you can gain public support, you can manufacture consent for it from the international community, because just the term terrorist holds such a negative connotation that you can use to justify endless slaughter of people. You can say that, oh, even civilians were, they were put there by the terrorists and no one bats an eye, no one questions it. And so following 9/11, the US killed more than 400,000 Iraqi people. 400,000, not to mention other civilians in Afghanistan, in Iran, all across the Middle East, murdering them with absolute impunity. Then we see the horrors of Abu Ghraib, where US soldiers are treating Muslim men and women, not necessarily at Abu Ghraib, like animals. And who are the real evil people here is really what we should be asking. Which regime is the evil one? There's no other way to look at it. It's so plain to see. And that puts us here into the next text, the indigenous people of Palestine, its original inhabitants. Now, this is actually an interview a conversation between Deleuze and Elias Sambar, who is a Palestinian French writer. He was actually a French translator, translated Arabic to French. He translated the work of Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, including others, and he and Deleuze were friends and they collaborated a lot, and here they discuss the Palestinian struggle. Here they discuss Palestinian art. Here they discuss Palestinian entry into actually academia, into French academia, with the publication of their first journal at the time, which was called in the early 80s, the Revue d'études Palestiniennes, which was the review of the study of Palestinian work and art and culture and stuff. So that's what they're talking about here. And specifically, they're pointing to, or at least they begin their conversation by pointing to the first words, or the words that open this journal, that read, "We are people like any other, and we only want to be that." And these are powerful words, and they're words that Deleuze clings to, in that the Palestinian movement is not an exceptional one. It's not one trying to make people into an exceptional people. In fact, he says that this is what sets them apart from Israelis who view themselves as being exceptional. in terms of their historical oppression, of Jewish oppression that they appropriate to justify their Israeli Zionist expansion, they see themselves as an exceptional people, whereas the Palestinians seek only to be recognized as people. And that is such a low bar to set, but it is one that seems like an impossibility given Israeli violence and Israeli repression, to just view Palestinians as people and to give them rights as though they are people. Now, the point of this journal, including all other Palestinian art and academia and cuisine and clothing and furniture and culture, all of it is meant to humanize Palestinians and to show the world, to break through the narrative that all Palestinians are just terrorists, as the Israeli regime often likes to suggest, that they are all somehow deserving of the violence that the Israeli regime inflicts on them. Now, given the title of this piece, Deleuze draws parallels, and so does Sandbar, between European colonialism and Israeli colonialism of the Palestinians. Now, there are commonalities. It's not the exact same, though. Like, obviously, there's so many differences, but there are many commonalities. These are people who are systematically murdered, dispossessed, and displaced. These are some of the key attributes of colonialism. One of the differences, though, is that these people within Palestine aren't colonized in that they aren't turned into a colony that is often used in terms of economic exploitation, because instead, Israel prioritizes displacing these people. They just want them out. They don't want them to be a cheap source of labor. No, Israel brings in labor from all over the world to do menial tasks. Like, that's not, they're not getting Palestinians to do that kind of stuff. In some cases they are, but that's not the overall goal. And that sets them apart from other colonial regimes that try to turn the people they colonize into a cheap vector of economic exploitation. And one of the other differences is that indigenous people, especially in the Americas, who were colonized by the French, the Spanish, the British, they didn't have anywhere to go. Like, all that land was being taken from them as they were being systematically erased. So it's not as though they could leave, and it's not as though Palestinians can leave. The one difference is that Palestinians can, technically enter other territories and be technically safe, which isn't true. Isn't true at all, because as we know, Israel would have no problem bombing them in the south of Lebanon if Palestinians entered there, and they were cowering in fear and tents, hoping that they weren't going to be blown up to oblivion. It's absolutely horrendous. Whereas indigenous people could only keep moving west to the point that they couldn't move west anymore, or move north into areas that the colonizers did not see hospitable. And then they would say, oh, well, the indigenous people can then live up there, except for those ones that already live there, like the Inuit in Canada, for example, or some other communities like the Dene people, for example. But many of them that were very comfortable living in southern, what is now Canada, then forced to move into areas that they didn't know how to actually live in, with different climates, with different territories, essentially as a way to kill them. It's one of the many horrendous tools of colonialism. Now, Sandbar notes, and he makes a very good point here, that Israel suddenly, and they often do this, where they'll say oh, well, if Palestinians are so great, why doesn't Egypt take them in? Why doesn't Jordan take them in? And Sandbar is it's super interesting the way that Israel very conveniently chooses to care about inter-Arab racism, which doesn't exist. It's not actually the thing at play here. But he's just pointing to the fact that Israel is using this as a talking point to deflect from their own violence, and they being the reason that Palestinians need to flee, that Palestinians need to evacuate, need to leave where they are, to have their land evacuated so that they can then live and not risk being put to death by the Israeli regime. Now, it is part of the Zionist dream to rid the land of Palestinians, to keep it purely as a Jewish state, to make sure that the purity of that land remains intact, to keep it Jewish, which wasn't the case before the Zionist project really took foot in the first Zionist terrorist groups like Irgun really started to terrorize Palestinians living there. Palestinians and Jewish people have lived harmoniously on that land for millennia, like anywhere else, because Jews are all over the world, Muslims are all over the world, and they've lived together forever. It is only when the Zionists actually set foot there and started to take that land, or to view the land as being primarily for Jewish feet alone, that they began to murder and to displace Palestinians from that territory. And they do this on the basis of a racial quality, to suggest that Jewish superiority being the reason that they deserve that land. They have more of a right to that land than the Palestinians. And it goes to show the attachment that Zionism has to European colonialism and its use of racism to justify European expansion and capture of indigenous peoples all over the world, from India to the Philippines to Mexico to Canada and so on. And again, in the face of all of this, all that the Palestinians are fighting for is access to their land, to be able to return to their land, which doesn't seem like the Israelis are going to permit following their slaughter of Palestinians. All that they want is that, and to be recognized as humans, to have the rights that humans deserve. And this is why they align, and they are the template for all struggles against oppression. And so one of the popular chants within many of the marches, many of the protests, is, in our thousands and our millions, we are all Palestinians, which speaks volumes about the way in which all people are united in the struggle against oppression. This is not just a Palestinian issue. This is a human issue, and it has to have to hold on to that fact and really drive that home to make sure that this never happens again. It stops and never happens again. And that puts us here into the final text, the Grandeur of Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO for like 40 or so years, from the 60s all the way to his death in 2004, I think, about 50 years. He was leader of the PLO. And he was an enigmatic figure, extremely important for the Palestinian movement. But perfect? No. Should we pay any attention to his imperfection at all, given that all of our attention should be focused on the Israeli regime? No, we shouldn't focus any attention on any of his imperfections at all, in my opinion. Absolutely not. He was instrumental in really bringing the Palestinian struggle to the world and showing the world that the Palestinians are people. Palestinians are people deserving of rights. And he was one of their first real political voices to make that the world understand that. And he resisted the expectation that the Israelis put on Palestinians, that they are just to expect and to accept their displacement, dispossession, and murder. And he opposed that vehemently. He opposed that with great force, hence the Israeli regime trying desperately to kill him for a long time. But he was relatively powerless in the face of the Israeli regime. After Israel killed innumerable people in southern Lebanon, cowering, taking shelter in refugee camps, after Israel killed them in cold blood, all that he could really say was shame. And these words ring true. They are words that we hear throughout all of the protests as well. Shame is a powerful word, and it's one that he really brought into public consciousness and international consciousness in terms of the Palestinian struggle, because he doesn't have a military to fight back. The Palestinians, being systematically denied this opportunity, had no other opportunity to them other than for him to say shame. And these words were extremely powerful, and they continue to resonate today. Now, in Deleuze's words to describe Israel's violence against the Palestinians in this text, he says that it is a genocide, but one in which physical extermination remains subordinate to geographical displacement. He says that it is a genocide where there is physical extermination. We're seeing it on display right now, but also, or more, its primary exercise is in terms of expelling these people from the land, which is a kind of genocide in itself. To rid that land of a people, to kill it, to rid it of that culture, to erase that culture as a kind of genocide here. Now, could Arafat have done more? Of course, obviously. Should we focus on that at all? Like I said, no. Who cares? All of our attention should be focused on the Israeli regime. But he did an amazing job, not at speaking for Palestinians or standing in for them, but giving them, really doing politics in a classic way, standing in for the people as their voice, without taking over their voice, without being their voice. And he respected that, and he was very much committed to the Palestinian people. He wasn't separate from them like our politicians in the US and Canada that they aren't going to interact with regular everyday folks behind their walls of defenses and everything. No, Arafat was committed to the Palestinian people as a people. And yeah, that'll conclude these 4 very important texts that Deleuze gives us about Palestine and his commitment to the Palestinian struggle. And I encourage you to get involved. I encourage you to donate if you can. If you don't have the monetary means, maybe you have the time, you can work with any of these organizations to help call for a ceasefire, to oppose and challenge what is currently going on in Gaza, Israel's violence against Gazans and against Palestinians, and to make amends for the decades of violence that Israel has been committing against the Palestinians. And on that note, take care.